Hello, welcome to The Honest Wargamer. I'm your host, Rob, and as the video title and thumbnail suggest, this is a deep dive of the Age of Sigmar stats as we are during May 2024. Everything that has been done here has been produced by my good friend and cohort Warhammer Rob. I'm a different Rob. And you can find all of this information on thehonestwargamer.com and go and look for the stats. All of the stats that we use are taken from 2-day events that haven't used any overt comp or, kind of special house rules. And then we put that together and bring all this data to coalesce in the Age of Sigmar stats, which you can see here. In my opinion, these are the most comprehensive and well thought through stats. They don't scrape data from like leagues or single games or one-day events. And there's a bunch of reasoning as to why we could go into, and I've covered these in other stats videos. But this is just our April 2024 update for what the state of the game, the state of the meta looks like for Age of Sigmar. And the answer is it looks really great. As we get towards the end of the edition, and very much close to this is the last, maybe second to last stats update we're going to get, the game has ended on a pretty nice place. If you look at the overall win rates, we can see that Blades of Khorne are just a little bit too good, even with the nerfs at a 56% win rate, and everything else has been brought into line here quite nicely. Gloomspite Gits and Beasts of Chaos are in that lower end at 44%, which is kind of interesting because we know both of those two armies definitely can get 5-0 wins. We've seen Beasts of Chaos get a 5-0 recently. We've seen multiple Gloomspite. Similarly, I've just done the Age of Sigmar Stat Center where Sylvaneth at the bottom have also gone 5-0 in an event recently as well. So I'm not surprised by that. Kharadron Overlords being up there is in no surprise to me, and Sons of Behemoth at 54% I think are going to continue over the course of Age of Sigmar 3 or the remaining few months to continuously keep getting massive podiums because they have to have easily one of the best positive win rate potential performances in the game, and also have one of the lowest skill caps needed to achieve that, which is fun. Slaanesh being up there towards the top is actually incredibly exciting. If you see at 53%, a lot of people think that Slaanesh potentially don't have it, if that makes sense. They maybe don't have the juice, but they are in there and they are kicking it, which is really fun. Skaven up there thanks to Skabic. Deepkin also quite interesting, lower representation for Deepkin, which means it's just got a better or higher skill cap player base, which is unsurprising. Lumineth still great. Flesh Eater Court's new and not doing too bad. So everything's looking pretty good. The one thing maybe that's a tad sad is Cities of Sigmar towards the bottom. They got an incredibly aggressive nerf just after the LVO in January, and then they continued to receive 2 to 3 more knee-jerk nerfs to their army. And while I have seen them do okay at events, I haven't seen them have any sort of the dominant top position that we've seen from something even newer like Flesh Eater Courts further up. Everything else is sitting in a pretty good place. I'd say one of the things to look out for is Stormcast Eternals at 48%. Because they're the starter army, and also because they're the army that most people own. The fact that probably the lowest skill expression group would be Stormcast Eternal players, that's not to say that that's all Stormcast Eternal players, but generally the average will be lower because it's a lot of new players just playing for their first time. The fact that it's 48% probably makes me think the Stormcast Eternals are in a really great place where normally they should be much higher. Now let's go look at the meta representation, which is one of my faves. Let's look at the meta. We'll see which the most popular armies are. And pretty surprisingly, Stormcast Eternals are back. Now, this is pretty interesting. Each faction, if it was played equally, would be 3.7% of the meta. So several of these armies are over that line. And Stormcast Eternals being the starter army and the new army out there isn't like a surprise, apart from if you've been keeping track of the stats over Age of Sigmar 3, where multiple times other factions and other armies have been the predominant army in the meta, which is quite interesting. I'm going to put this straight down to Ionis Cryptborn being released and also the Skywing being something that's playable as well. That said, also many people, in my opinion, have been really excited about putting a bunch of the really cool units like Night Judicators with Gryph-hounds on the table and playing those sorts of aggressive shooting AoE mortal damage lists. which we've seen many times over the past few months. So I'm unsurprised to see Stormcast Eternals back up there, but it is actually a shock versus the average of what you would expect it to be. Like you would expect, I guess in 40k, Space Marines to always be the most numerous and popular if you collect them all together. Flesh Eater Courts, as the newest army on the block, in second place is not a surprise to me either. Also because many people already had armies that they could grandfather in to their new battle tome when it came out and add a couple more units versus having to build up a whole new army. Slaves to Darkness being the literal counterpoint to Stormcast Eternals being popular and also cool as hell is incredibly good. Then Gloomspike Gits up there as well, easily one of the most popular factions, but their book is a little bit older now. Seraphon, also super popular. Soulblight, Blades of Khorne. Blades of Khorne definitely up there, I would argue, because they are just such a strong faction at the minute. Ogre Maw Tribe's up there, incredibly easy to produce and put on the table. The production meta for them is really low, as well as the mental load that you have to use to play them at an event. Sylvaneth up there is not a surprise, just incredibly pretty army. Ossiarch Bone Reapers, Sons of Behemoth is getting more popular as well. Cities of Sigmar up there, and then Skaven. And the underrepresented ones, obviously Bone Splitters, which we know are getting squatted. Disciples of Tzeentch, almost unplayable. Their 3rd edition book was truly not a very good book. It's probably... I'll probably do a tier list, actually, on... that'd be a great video. We'll do a tier list on the best books of this edition. And I'm going to say Disciples of Tzeentch will probably end up at the bottom. Beasts of Chaos, we know are getting squatted, but being played all around the world by fans still... still doing well at 2%. Fire Slayers, super rare, and I think it really requires someone like Phil, whose recent Droth Wrangler list really has it ignited the flame of people's passion for Fire Slayers, making them hotter. Nice, there was a lot of flame references there. Cruel Boys, while they had their moment in the sun, they're almost always usurped by the Big War. I think, during Age of Sigmar 4, they'll get a massive resurgence. Sinesh, tough army to put on the table. They have been much more popular. They're not that... I think people perceive them as not being that good right now, but they've actually been doing pretty good at events. Deepkin, Daughters of Cain, they really need some range refreshes, I think, to really want to see the table much more. Iron Jaws, similar. I think they should do with a few more models, or at least their models having more options to play in Age of Sigmar 4. And then we could keep going through. Everything's in a good spot. Magic and Nurgle on a massive rise in popularity ever since we obviously got that Glotkin update, where you used to never see Magickin apart from the flies. They kind of bookended both the Age of Sigmar 3 edition. At the beginning, it was all about those Pushkill Blight Lords. At the end, it's all been about Glotkin and the monsters. But having 2 big builds across all of it is actually pretty exciting. So if we take a look at the faction win rates per month, we can start to see where some of the balance updates and nerfs have really affected different armies, and how some armies' popularity and growth in popularity has really increased their effectiveness on the tabletop. First one I'll obviously talked about already, Cities of Sigmar at the bottom left-hand corner here. You can see that Cities of Sigmar had this kind of singular big spike during January, and then they just got slammed by nerfs, making them one of the worst armies in the game and bringing them right back to the bottom, which feels completely unnecessary. It didn't even give the meta a single month to adjust, just immediately slammed, which is wild. Blades of Khorne, on the other hand, even though they've had continual nerfs, have shown a consistent and positive win rate ever since their book launch, and they have just been doing increasingly and continuously well. If anything, they got a little bit better in the last update, to be honest. Sons of Behemoth is also another great story, where we can see their popularity dropped off pretty massively, and then once we got King Broad Stump, we started to get a real resurgence with this army, and this army started to perform incredibly well. Stop giving 5-up ward saves to units with 40 wounds. That becomes a massive problem. Deepkin, we're not doing particularly well, but I think Deep King players reassessed what to do with their lists. We got the Shark build, and then we ended up with an okay to middling performance from them. Then we got Flesh Eater Courts. You can see they got a little bit of a tick, but they did not take the aggressive points. Flesh Eater Courts and Cities of Sigmar are kind of a perfect one-for-one mirror of their initial spike in performance for Flesh Eater Courts being high, and then they dropped as people learned how to deal with them or to change the list around. However, on the other side, obviously, you don't have that same story as well. Fire Slayers, as you can see, have had a bit of an uptick, and that's because of more popular and more recent builds. Maggotkin of Nurgle, again, they kind of have fluctuated a little bit, but they've maintained that consistent build since they got that Glotkin play and that Glotkin list. Ogre Mortri's popularity is on the increase. The Stonehorn build just continuously does well, especially in the positive win rate potential. It keeps going. The Big War taking that nerf that they needed to take, dropping them down into the mid-table. And you shouldn't be trying to play Big War. You should be trying to play Cruel Boys, or you should be trying to play Iron Jaws, in my opinion, which is good. The next step we're going to look at is the sub-faction meta representation. What this does, effectively, is it tells you what the best or best performing sub-faction is for each army, so you can really get some identity. So, for example, you might think Seraphon only have a 50% win rate. However, if you play Fangs of Sotek, they actually have a 56% win rate. Same with Sons of Behemoth. You might think that they only have a 54% win rate, but actually King Broadstomp has a 56. This is where you start to see the egregious builds that you have in certain armies, and where you get just basically a better representation of what the game looks like. For instance, Deepkin, when they're playing all sharks in Futhwan, they have a 51% win rate. So they're doing even better than you might think. Same for Khorne. When they're playing Reapers of Vengeance, they're up at 55%. Stormcast Eternals, Hammers of Sigmar, 52%. Pretender's Host for Heat Knights is 52%, although that's the largest proportion of their meta, which is quite fun. And then Grinning Blades for Cruel Boys have a 49% win rate. So this really lets you know that actually Age of Sigmar as a game is really built into the sub-factions which make, or Age of Sigmar 3, is built into the game with the sub-factions that perform the best for that army, and some of the other sub-factions really bring the army down. And normally it's because the production meta, or buying, building and painting and putting it on the table, takes a long time. So if you were to build, I don't know, a Deepkin army that wasn't all sharks, and so you basically themed it around a different sub-faction, then you wouldn't be able to play the Oops, I Did All Sharks list and therefore have a higher win rate. And so this kind of gives you an idea that some rules and some sub-faction rules really bring up the quality and the effectiveness of different armies. And that's what that table does there, which is quite fun. The next chart that we are going to show off is the TWhip ratio. Now, this is not my preferred way of tracking this information. I prefer the PWP, but the TWhip ratio is thanks to my friends, the Falcon and Val at the 40k Stat Center. What this does is this shows you the win rates, or like the potential of an army, or the TWhip number of an army, based on how it does at an event. And I know what you're going to say, that's what win rate percentage does. No, this is slightly different. Effectively, what this does is, if you have an army that goes 4-1 all the time, but it loses its first game and wins the next 4, that will have a lower TWhip number than an army that wins its first 4, but loses its last 1. That's because, in theory, losing the first game is much easier to do than losing, it's much harder to do, losing your first game, and it's much easier to lose your last game, because the last game at an event should be the hardest game, and the first game should be the easiest game. And what this effectively does is it aggregates all those numbers down, so you end up with this. So you end up with armies that are doing really well up until the last game. So they're quite likely to go 4-1, or they're a bit of they get gate kept at the end of the game. And that's what the TWhip ratio does. There it is for all of the different factions. Go and break this down for yourself, and that is how the TWhip works. For the 3+ wins, this is my preferred, so the PWP, or the positive win rate potential. So if you're like new to Age of Sigmar and you'd like to play an army, you're like, I would like to go to an event, Rob, and I'd like to win more games, a 5-round event, than I lose, I'd like to do that, then you would look at the 3+ wins, or the positive win rate potential graph here. And here you can see Big War at the top at 61%. They're an army that's more likely to go 3-2 than anything else. This is for players that aren't really looking for the perfect top-tier table tournament army, and who just want to be aware that running the host Heathen Knights of Slaanesh or Cruel Boys or Sylvaneth means that you're more likely to lose more games than you are to win more games. Are you still going to be able to win events with these armies? Absolutely. You're going to be able to win with every army pretty much in the game, which is actually a pretty great place for the game to be. However, you are more likely to win more games with Big War, Kharadron Overlords, Sigmar, Blades of Khorne, Seraphon, and Magic and Nurgle than you are any of the other armies. And some of them are really high, like Kharadron Overlords and Sigmar and Big War. However, they're not as big as they have been in the past. And I would argue that probably Sons of Behemoth will end up pushing up there by the end of at the end of Age of Sigmar 3. And lastly, for the stats, if you want to go and look at the player standings, you can go and look at all the player standings from everyone all around the world up here, and you can see who's doing the best either in your local country, or you can see who's doing the best all around the world and maybe get in touch with them, talk about lists, and do all of those other things. Thanks very much to Rob for putting all those stats together. I got to say that having done stats now for maybe 6 years, or presenting stats for up to 6 years, Age of Sigmar 3 concludes its position in its kind of like with its fellow editions as being incredibly well balanced towards the end. It might be fairly rock, paper, scissors. That's true. It might also be a game where pretty much everyone continuously scores points all the time. And therefore, it's really about the points that you lose, not necessarily the points that you gain. There's a lot of what we would call, pity points for the boring tactics where you just stand somewhere and get 2 points. However, that said, it seems to be a game that people really enjoy playing. People really enjoy getting in and out of boats, just moving on to objective, moving to the board edges, just casting a spell. They seem to really enjoy that prospect because event numbers, as we said, are high and people keep going to events, keep playing with different armies. And that's actually really exciting. So I think Age of Sigmar 3, in retrospect, and I'm going to make a bunch of retrospect videos, is going to be a really interesting kind of addition to think about and talk about at the end, because I think it's created a lot of provable through lines of what people enjoy about gaming, what makes good armies, what makes good balance, what makes an enjoyable event experience. And I think many of those things have come through in the stats. And I think that's been really interesting as well. Some of it's been emotive, some of it's been factual, and it's been really interesting. Even me, obviously, as your host for trying to deliver the stats, as much as I try to stay objective on this information, sometimes subjectiveness comes through, and you can only have as much experience as your lived experience. I run loads of events. I do the event stats every weekend. I try to plug in as much as I can, but even then, there are other players and people around the world who maybe even have even more experience, play at a GT every weekend, and then people like yourselves who maybe don't play as much. And I'd love to know what all of you think in the comments. That's where I can find out the most information. And if you do love what you've seen on the stats and want us to keep us, we're going to keep doing stats for Age of Sigmar 4, so I don't know why I've said keep doing it, but if you'd like to help support the show, then obviously you can like, comment, subscribe, and do all those other things, which will really help us out. Share it with your friends, which would be cool. And thank you to Rob and Tom for helping me produce the stats and put them on the website. They're both great, and I want to thank them a load. Thanks for watching the video. See you soon.